The ice hung from the ceiling in crystalline sheets, thick as a man's forearm, translucent and gleaming in the firelight. Lars Eriksson stood in the center of his cabin, watching the formations grow with the careful attention of a gardener tending prized roses. Outside, the blizzard of 1856 howled across northern Minnesota with a fury that had already killed 2 men and collapsed 3 cabins within 5 miles of where he stood. Inside, despite the ice overhead, despite what every trapper in the territory would call madness, Lars's cabin was warm, solid, and growing stronger with every degree the temperature dropped. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The year was 1853, and Lars Eriksson had survived his first Minnesota winter by luck more than skill. He was 31 years old, a Norwegian immigrant who had come to America 3 years earlier with nothing but carpentry skills, learned from his father, and memories of fishing villages, where winter meant darkness and ice for half the year. The fur trade had drawn him west, not for wealth, but for solitude and a chance to live on his own terms. He had built his cabin that first autumn using techniques brought from Norway, solid construction that would have served well in the coastal climate he knew. But Minnesota was different. The cold here was not the damp, penetrating chill of the North Sea. It was dry, absolute, and brutal in ways that made his homeland's winters seem gentle. Lars had established his trap lines along the tributaries feeding into Lake Superior, working a territory that put him 2 days' travel from the nearest trading post. The isolation suited him. He spoke English poorly and preferred his own company to the rough society of other trappers. His cabin sat in a clearing he had carved from dense pine forest, positioned to catch morning sun and sheltered from prevailing winds by a ridge of granite that rose behind it. The location was well chosen by the standards he knew, but those standards had been formed in a different world. That first winter taught him that survival in Minnesota required more than solid walls and a good fireplace. The cold was relentless. Temperatures dropped to depths he had never experienced. Snow fell in quantities that buried his cabin to the windowsills by January. He learned to pack snow against his walls for additional insulation, to keep his fire burning through the night, to ration his firewood with miserly care because the work of cutting and hauling logs in deep snow was exhausting beyond measure. He survived, but others did not. In February of 1853, a trapper named Henrik Johansson, another Norwegian who had befriended Lars, died when his cabin roof collapsed under snow weight. Henrik had built his cabin quickly the previous autumn, anxious to complete it before winter arrived. The roof was adequate by normal standards, poles laid across log walls and covered with layers of bark and sod. It had seemed solid enough. But as snow accumulated through December and January, the weight became immense. A wet, heavy snowfall in mid-February added the final burden. The roof gave way at 3 in the morning while Henrik slept. They found his body 4 days later when Lars came to check on him after noticing no smoke from his chimney. Henrik had died instantly, crushed beneath logs and snow. Lars helped bury Henrik when the ground thawed that spring, and the manner of death haunted him far more than the loss itself. Lars spent the summer of 1853 thinking about Henrik's death in ways that other trappers found unhealthy. They told him to move on, to accept that accidents happened in the wilderness, that a man could not prevent every tragedy. But Lars could not let it go. Henrik had not been killed by a bear or a fall through ice or any of the dangers men accepted as inevitable. He had been killed by the fundamental problem of building shelter in a place where snow accumulated in weights that exceeded what reasonable construction could support. If the problem was fundamental, Lars reasoned, then perhaps the solution required fundamentally different thinking. The idea came to him not through logic, but through memory. In the fishing village where he had grown up, ice was not simply an obstacle to be overcome. Ice houses preserved fish through summer months, using ice's insulating properties to maintain cold temperatures long after winter ended. Ice roads allowed travel across frozen lakes that would be impassable in summer. Ice, when properly understood and managed, could be a tool rather than purely a threat. Lars had watched his father and other fishermen work with ice, shaping it, using it, respecting its properties, while making it serve human purposes. What if the same principle could apply to cabin construction? Every trapper knew that moisture from cooking, breathing, and fire created condensation that turned to ice wherever warm air met cold surfaces. Standard practice was to fight that ice formation, to keep living spaces dry, to ventilate moisture away before it could freeze. But what if instead of fighting ice formation, you directed it? What if you built a structure where ice was supposed to form, where it became part of the roof's function rather than a problem to be solved? The other trappers thought he was insane when he began explaining his theory that autumn. Lars's English was still halting, which made his explanation sound even more confused than they were. He tried to describe how ice could add strength to a roof if properly supported, how it could create insulation, how it could seal gaps that let cold air penetrate. The trappers listened with barely concealed amusement. Ice expanded when it froze, they pointed out. It would crack logs and destroy any structure foolish enough to invite it inside. Ice was heavy, they said. Adding ice weight to snow weight would guarantee collapse, not prevent it. Lars could not adequately answer these objections because he did not yet fully understand how his idea would work in practice. He knew only that conventional construction had killed Henrik and that winter would kill others if nothing changed. He had a vision of a roof that grew stronger as winter deepened, that used ice as reinforcement rather than fighting it as an enemy. But vision and execution were different things, and Lars was honest enough to admit he did not know how to make his theory reality. He decided to experiment on his own cabin that winter. The risk was substantial. If his theory was wrong, he might destroy his own shelter and die as Henrik had died. But Lars had spent enough winters in Norway to trust his instincts about ice, and his instincts told him there was something worth pursuing in this mad idea. The winter of 1853 nearly killed Lars Eriksson. His first attempt at controlled ice formation was a disaster that taught him the difference between theory and reality. He had modified his cabin's roof in November, creating intentional gaps where warm air could reach cold surfaces and form ice. He imagined the ice would grow slowly, predictably, reinforcing the structure as it accumulated. Instead, within 2 weeks of the first hard freeze, his cabin became a nightmare of uncontrolled ice growth and dangerous living conditions. The ice formed everywhere, not just where Lars had planned. It grew on the interior walls in thick sheets. It accumulated on his ceiling in formations that dripped meltwater whenever his fire burned hot. It covered his sleeping platform, his supplies, his clothing. The moisture he had deliberately allowed into his roof space condensed on every cold surface, and in Minnesota winter, almost every surface was cold. Within a month, Lars was living in what amounted to an ice cave with a fire pit in the center. The temperature inside his cabin dropped dangerously low, despite his fire burning constantly. The problem was that his modifications had destroyed the cabin's ability to retain heat. Warm air escaped through the gaps he had created, replaced by frigid air that poured in from outside. The ice formation was dramatic and extensive, but it provided no benefit. Instead, it created structural problems as ice expanded in cracks between logs, forcing them apart. His carefully fitted walls began separating at the joints. His door frame warped. The roof sagged under ice weight that was not properly supported by his crude additional framing. By January, Lars was burning through his firewood supply at an unsustainable rate just to maintain barely livable temperatures. He had prepared enough wood for a normal winter, but his modified cabin required 3 times the fuel to heat. He spent his days cutting and hauling wood in brutal cold, an exhausting cycle that left him weakened and frostbitten. His trap lines went unchecked. His food supplies dwindled because he had no time or energy for hunting. He lost nearly 30 pounds through the winter, his body consuming itself to generate heat in a cabin that could not hold warmth. The other trappers heard about his situation when a traveling trader visited in February and spread word of what Lars had done. Some thought it was funny, vindication of their warnings that his ice theory was madness. Others felt genuine concern that Lars would not survive to spring. A trapper named Thomas Brennan made the journey to Lars's cabin in March to check on him and found Lars barely alive, huddled near his fire, surrounded by ice formations that had made his home uninhabitable. Thomas convinced Lars to abandon the experiment and helped him seal the gaps that were destroying his cabin's integrity. They spent 3 days making emergency repairs that would at least allow the structure to function as normal shelter for the remainder of winter. Lars survived, but the experience had broken something in most men's determination. Thomas expected Lars to give up his mad theory about ice roofs and return to conventional thinking. Instead, as his strength returned and the immediate crisis passed, Lars became more determined than ever. He had failed, yes, but he had also learned. The idea was not wrong, his execution had been wrong, and that meant there was still a way to make it work. Lars spent the spring and summer of 1854 obsessed with understanding his failure. He had proven that uncontrolled ice formation was disastrous, but he had also observed something important during those terrible winter months. In the few places where ice had formed in thick solid layers, properly supported by his framing, those sections had actually insulated better than the rest of his cabin. The problem was not ice itself. The problem was controlling where it formed, how much formed, and ensuring the structure could support and benefit from it rather than being destroyed by it. He began systematically studying how ice formed under different conditions. He watched ice accumulate on the shore of Lake Superior, noting how it built up in layers when waves splashed against cold rocks. He examined ice houses used by fishermen, seeing how thick ice walls maintained stable, cold temperatures through changing weather. He paid attention to frost patterns on windows, understanding that ice formed where temperature differential was greatest. The key insight came slowly through observation and reflection. Ice needed 3 things to form: cold surface, warm, moist air, and contact between the two. If you could control those 3 elements, you could control ice formation. Lars realized his first attempt had failed because he allowed warm air to escape freely, creating ice everywhere while destroying his cabin's heat retention. What he needed was a way to keep his living space warm and dry while deliberately creating a cold space where ice could form under controlled conditions. The solution required a completely different roof design, something no trapper had attempted because it seemed unnecessarily complex. Lars needed 2 roofs, not 1. An inner roof that stayed warm from cabin heat below and an outer roof exposed to winter cold. Between them, a space where he could control airflow, moisture levels, and ice formation. He spent the entire summer rebuilding his cabin's roof system from the ground up. The inner roof was constructed from split logs fitted tightly together and sealed with a mixture of clay and pine pitch he rendered himself. This layer was designed to be as airtight as possible, keeping cabin warmth and moisture inside the living space. Above it, he created a gap of 18 inches, a void space that would become his ice formation chamber. The outer roof was conventional construction, poles and bark designed to shed snow and rain. Lars built a ventilation system using hollowed logs positioned at strategic points. These served as channels that could draw warm, moist air from his cabin into the gap between roofs, but only where and when Lars chose to open them. He could close these channels with wooden plugs, giving him precise control over how much moisture entered his ice chamber. He installed observation ports, small openings covered with translucent animal membrane that let him see ice formation without disrupting the system. The entire design was built around deliberate control rather than hoping natural processes would work in his favor. The construction took 4 months of solo work. Other trappers who saw the complex double roof system thought Lars had learned nothing from his previous failure. Lars did not try to convince them. He simply continued working, knowing winter would prove whether his understanding was correct. The technical details of Lars's construction revealed a level of sophistication that seemed impossible for a solo trapper working with hand tools. The framework supporting his double roof system was engineered with precision that would have impressed professional builders in eastern cities. Lars used peeled pine logs selected for straightness and uniform diameter, positioned to distribute weight across multiple load-bearing points. He understood instinctively what engineers would later describe mathematically, that properly distributed loads could support far more weight than concentrated stress points. The inner roof required waterproofing that would maintain its seal through repeated freeze-thaw cycles. Lars created a compound using rendered bear fat mixed with pine pitch and crushed charcoal. He boiled the mixture for hours until it reached a consistency that would remain pliable in cold, but would not drip or run when warm air rose from below. He applied this mixture between every joint of his split log ceiling, building up layers until no light penetrated from above. The result was a barrier that kept cabin moisture inside while remaining flexible enough to accommodate the wood's natural expansion and contraction. Between the inner and outer roofs, Lars installed a network of wooden channels shaped from split logs with their centers hollowed out. These channels connected to his ventilation ports and ran throughout the 18-inch gap, creating pathways for controlled air movement. The channels were positioned to ensure even distribution of moisture throughout the ice chamber. Lars had learned from his first failed attempt that ice forming in concentrated areas created dangerous weight imbalances. His channel system would allow ice to form evenly across the entire roof span. The outer roof was simpler but still carefully constructed. Lars used straight poles laid close together, covered with overlapping sheets of birch bark he had harvested and prepared during summer. Over the bark, he added a layer of sod cut in rectangular sections and fitted together like shingles. This outer layer was designed to shed snow and rain while remaining cold enough that the gap beneath would maintain freezing temperatures even when his cabin was warm inside. The observation ports were Lars's innovation for monitoring his system without disrupting it. He created small openings at 6 locations across his roof, each covered with a thin membrane made from deer intestine that had been stretched, dried, and treated with oil until it became translucent. These membranes allowed light to pass through, letting Lars see ice formation inside his roof chamber. He could observe thickness, coverage, and formation patterns without opening the system and releasing precious cold or allowing uncontrolled airflow. The entire structure required materials Lars had gathered throughout the summer. He had cut and prepared over 200 split logs for his inner roof. He had rendered 30 pounds of bear fat and collected 20 gallons of pine pitch. He had hollowed out 40 feet of ventilation channels. He had harvested and prepared enough birch bark to cover 400 square feet of roof surface. The work had consumed his entire summer, leaving no time for trapping or income. Lars was gambling everything on a theory that every experienced trapper in the territory considered insane. By late September of 1854, his impossible roof was complete, and winter was coming to test whether his obsession had produced genius or guaranteed his death. Winter arrived early in 1855, with hard frost coming in late October and the first significant snowfall in early November. Lars had spent the autumn preparing his supplies and checking every detail of his roof system, looking for flaws or weaknesses he might have missed during construction. He had gathered enough firewood to last through spring, anticipating that his new design might require adjustments to his heating strategy. He had stocked food for 6 months, unwilling to risk needing to leave his cabin during the critical testing period. Everything was ready, but Lars felt the weight of uncertainty that comes before any true experiment. He would either prove his theory correct or die trying. The first test came on November 12th, when temperatures dropped below freezing and stayed there for 3 consecutive days. Lars began his protocol carefully, opening one ventilation port partially to allow a small amount of cabin moisture into his roof chamber. He monitored the observation ports constantly, watching for the first signs of ice formation. For 2 days, nothing visible happened. The warm, moist air entering the gap between his roofs simply vented out through small gaps in his outer roof layer, carrying heat away without forming ice. Lars worried he had made his outer roof too porous, that he would never achieve the temperature differential needed for controlled freezing. On the 3rd day, he saw the first crystal formations appearing on the underside of his outer roof, visible through his observation membranes as tiny sparkles of reflected light. Ice was forming, but slowly and in small quantities. Lars adjusted his approach, closing some ventilation ports entirely and opening others more fully, trying to create concentrated moisture flow to specific areas. The ice growth accelerated. Within a week, he could see substantial formations developing, translucent layers building up where his channels directed moisture flow. The ice was forming exactly where his framework was strongest, distributing weight to his carefully positioned support structures. By December, Lars had ice accumulation of 3 to 4 inches throughout his roof chamber. The formations were beautiful when viewed through his observation ports, crystalline structures that caught and reflected the dim winter light. But more importantly, they were functional. Lars noticed immediately that his cabin retained heat far better than it ever had. The ice layer was acting as insulation, creating a barrier that trapped warmth inside his living space. He was using less firewood to maintain comfortable temperatures, exactly the opposite of his disastrous first attempt. The ice continued growing as winter deepened. By January, Lars had ice layers 8 to 10 inches thick throughout his roof system. The weight was substantial, but his framework supported it easily because the load was distributed evenly. His cabin stayed warm with half the firewood he had used in previous winters. The temperature inside remained stable even during the brutal cold snaps that characterized Minnesota January weather. Lars began opening and closing his ventilation ports strategically, learning to control ice growth rate and thickness with increasing precision. His impossible theory was working, but the real test was still coming. The blizzard arrived on January 18, 1856, with a ferocity that old trappers would talk about for decades. The storm came out of the northwest, driving snow horizontally with winds that bent pine trees and created drifts 20 feet high in places where terrain funneled the wind. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero, cold enough that exposed skin froze in minutes, and breathing the air felt like inhaling knives. The blizzard lasted 4 days without pause, burying the landscape under snow accumulation measured in feet rather than inches. It was the kind of storm that killed anyone caught outside and tested every structure's ability to withstand nature's full assault. Lars spent those 4 days inside his cabin, tending his fire and monitoring his roof system through the observation ports. The snow accumulation on his outer roof was immense, far exceeding anything he had calculated during his summer planning. He estimated at least 6 feet of snow piled on top of his structure by the second day, with drifts against his walls rising nearly to his roof line. The weight pressing down on his cabin was extraordinary. Thousands of pounds of snow and ice bearing down on the framework he had built with such care. Lars knew that conventional cabin roofs were collapsing under this load throughout the territory. He could do nothing but wait and watch, trusting that his design would hold. The ice layer between his roofs responded to the increased load in ways Lars had not anticipated but immediately recognized as beneficial. As snow weight pressed down on his outer roof, it compressed the ice formations underneath, making them denser and stronger. The ice was not cracking or failing under pressure. Instead, it was behaving like a structural element, distributing the load across his support framework more effectively than wood alone could have managed. Lars watched through his observation ports as the ice layer compressed from 10 inches to roughly 8 inches. But in becoming denser, it became more rigid and load-bearing. The physics were working exactly as he had hoped, though he lacked the technical vocabulary to describe what he was observing. More remarkably, the thicker snow layer on his outer roof improved his cabin's insulation even further. The snow acted as an additional barrier against cold, and the ice layer beneath it created a stable temperature zone between his warm interior and the frigid exterior. Lars found himself needing very little firewood to maintain comfortable temperatures inside. The heat from his modest fire was being trapped so efficiently that his cabin felt warmer during this brutal blizzard than it had during mild cold snaps in previous winters. The multiple layers of his roof system, snow on top, then bark and poles, then ice, then his sealed inner roof, created insulation so effective it seemed to defy reason. On the 5th day, the storm broke and Lars ventured outside to survey the damage. His cabin stood solid and intact, barely affected by the storm that had tested it. But smoke was missing from chimneys he could see in the distance, and Lars knew with grim certainty that some of those cabins had failed. Over the next week, as travel became possible again, the news confirmed his fears. 3 cabins had collapsed under snow load. Spring thaw in 1856 revealed the full extent of winter's damage across the trapping territory. 2 men had died in cabin collapses during the January blizzard, crushed in their sleep like Henrik Johansson 3 years earlier. A 3rd trapper had survived his roof collapse but lost both feet to frostbite after spending 2 days exposed to brutal cold before help arrived. 5 other cabins had sustained major damage, requiring complete rebuilding. The winter had been catastrophic for the trapping community, killing or crippling men and destroying shelters that represented months of labor. Against this backdrop of destruction, Lars Eriksson's cabin stood unmarked, its revolutionary design having weathered the worst storm in memory without visible strain. Word spread quickly among trappers about Lars's ice roof system and its improbable success. The initial reaction was skepticism, bordering on hostility. Men who had lost friends or nearly died themselves could not accept that the solution to winter survival had been discovered by a Norwegian who barely spoke English and whose methods defied every principle of frontier construction. Some claimed Lars had simply been lucky, that his cabin's location had protected it from the worst snow accumulation. Others suggested his cabin must have sustained damage he was hiding, that the ice roof would fail eventually and vindicate conventional wisdom. But some men were willing to listen, particularly those who had survived close calls or witnessed the aftermath of collapsed roofs. A trapper named Thomas Brennan, the same man who had helped Lars survive his first disastrous experiment, made the journey to Lars's cabin in April to see the ice roof system firsthand. Lars showed him everything, explaining through his halting English and frequent gestures how the double roof worked, how ventilation controlled ice formation, how the ice layer provided both insulation and structural support. Thomas examined the framework, studied the ventilation channels, and looked through the observation ports at ice formations that were beginning to melt as spring temperatures arrived. Thomas was convinced but cautious. He had seen Lars nearly die during the first failed attempt and knew that replicating the successful design would require precision most trappers lacked. He asked Lars if he would help construct an ice roof on Thomas's cabin, offering to provide labor and materials in exchange for guidance. Lars agreed immediately. He had never sought to profit from his innovation and genuinely wanted others to benefit from what he had learned through painful trial and error. The two men spent 3 weeks that summer building an ice roof system on Thomas's cabin, located about 8 miles from Lars's site. The construction attracted visitors, other trappers who came to watch and judge whether this approach was worth attempting. Lars and Thomas worked methodically, explaining each step to anyone willing to listen. Some observers remained skeptical, pointing out the extra time and materials required compared to conventional construction. But others saw potential in a system that had survived conditions which killed men using standard methods. By the time Thomas's ice roof was complete, 3 other trappers had decided to attempt similar modifications to their own cabins before winter returned. By 1860, 12 cabins in the northern Minnesota trapping territory used variations of Lars's ice roof design. The technique had spread primarily through Scandinavian immigrants who understood ice's properties from their homeland experiences and were willing to invest the extra labor required for construction. Each builder adapted the basic principles to their specific situation, creating variations that reflected available materials and individual skill levels. Some used simpler ventilation systems than Lars's elaborate channels. Others added innovations Lars had not considered, like adjustable external vents that could be opened or closed from outside without entering the roof chamber. The core concept remained constant: controlled ice formation between double roof layers that provided insulation and structural reinforcement rather than creating problems. The practical advantages extended beyond surviving extreme weather. Ice roof cabins were noticeably warmer in winter, requiring roughly half the firewood of conventional construction. This represented significant savings in labor and time, freeing trappers to focus on their actual work rather than endless woodcutting. The cabins were quieter during storms because the multiple roof layers and ice dampened wind noise. They were drier inside because the sealed inner roof prevented moisture penetration that plagued standard construction. Most significantly, they simply lasted longer. Conventional cabins required major repairs or rebuilding every 3 to 5 years as roofs sagged and logs settled. Ice roof cabins maintained structural integrity for decades because the ice layer prevented the stress concentrations that caused conventional roofs to fail. Lars continued refining his technique through the late 1850s, experimenting with different ventilation configurations and observation methods. He began keeping a journal in Norwegian, documenting his modifications and the reasoning behind them. The journal was practical rather than philosophical, filled with measurements, sketches, and notes about what worked and what failed. Lars was not trying to create a legacy, He was simply recording information that might prove useful to himself or others who attempted similar construction. He trained several younger trappers in ice roof construction techniques, spending summers helping them build their own systems. Lars never charged for his assistance or tried to profit from his innovation. His motivation was straightforward. He had watched Henrik die in a collapsed cabin, had nearly died himself during his first failed experiment, and had learned through painful experience how to build shelter that could withstand Minnesota winters. If that knowledge could prevent others from dying the way Henrik had died, then sharing it was simply the right thing to do. Lars left the trapping life in 1868 at age 46. The fur trade had largely collapsed, and Lars had saved enough to purchase a small farm near Duluth where the climate was slightly less brutal. He married a widow named Ingrid Sorensen in 1869 and spent his remaining years farming and doing occasional carpentry work. He died quietly in his sleep in 1873, never knowing that his ice roof technique would be studied by historians and engineers more than a century later. To Lars, it had been a practical solution to a specific problem, nothing more. But practical solutions that save lives have a way of outlasting the men who create them. The cabin site was discovered in 1973 by a University of Minnesota graduate student conducting archaeological surveys of 19th-century trapping settlements. What caught the researchers' attention was not the cabin itself, which had partially collapsed decades earlier, but the unusual roof structure that remained partially intact despite a century of abandonment. The double-layer construction was immediately recognizable as something different from standard frontier building techniques. Further investigation revealed the ventilation channels, observation ports, and framework designed to support substantial ice weight. The graduate student had stumbled onto physical evidence of Lars Eriksson's ice roof innovation, preserved in weathered wood and rusted iron fittings. Over the following decades, historians and engineers began piecing together the story of ice roof construction in northern Minnesota. They found references in trappers' journals and correspondence that mentioned the technique, often dismissively, but sometimes with grudging respect. They located 3 other cabin sites that showed evidence of double roof construction with characteristics matching Lars's design. Most significantly, they discovered Lars's Norwegian language journal in the possession of his great-granddaughter, who had preserved it without understanding its historical importance. The journal provided detailed documentation of his construction methods, his reasoning, and his systematic approach to solving the problem of winter survival. Modern structural engineers analyzing Lars's technique recognized sophisticated understanding of principles that would not be formally described until decades after his death. His double roof system anticipated modern concepts of thermal barriers and controlled ventilation. His use of ice as a structural element demonstrated intuitive grasp of material properties and load distribution. His framework design showed understanding of stress management that professional architects would have struggled to improve. Lars had no formal education in engineering or physics, yet he had developed solutions that reflected deep comprehension of how materials behaved under extreme conditions. Several historical preservation groups have attempted to reconstruct functioning ice roof cabins using Lars's documented techniques. The results validate his approach completely. Reconstructed cabins using his methods survive modern Minnesota winters with the same advantages Lars described: superior insulation, reduced heating requirements, and structural integrity under heavy snow loads. The reconstructions have become educational sites where visitors can see how one man's obsessive focus on solving a problem created innovation that seemed impossible by the standards of his era. The broader lesson of Lars Eriksson's story extends beyond cabin construction techniques. Innovation on the frontier often came from necessity confronting individuals willing to question conventional wisdom. Lars was not trying to revolutionize anything, he was trying to prevent more deaths like Henrik Johansson's. His solution required rejecting the fundamental assumption that ice was purely an enemy to be fought, recognizing instead that ice could be a tool when properly understood and controlled. That intellectual leap, combined with methodical experimentation and willingness to learn from catastrophic failure, created something genuinely new. The phrase ice roof cabin never became widely known outside historical circles, but the principle Lars demonstrated remains relevant. Sometimes solving impossible problems requires accepting that the problem itself is misunderstood. Lars did not build a cabin that could withstand ice. He built a cabin that used ice. That distinction made all the difference between innovation that saved lives and conventional thinking that kept killing people in collapsed shelters scattered across the frozen frontier.